Welcome to the Spirit of Education and Professional Practice. I'm Julian Stern. I'm a Professor of Education and Religion at Bishop Grosseteste University and previously worked at York St John University. It's good to be with you. I will start with a photograph that I'll come back to later in my talk, a photograph of a classroom, and we'll be looking and seeing if we can apply what I say about spirituality to that classroom towards the end of my talk. But to start off with, I'd like to introduce myself and how I came to research spirituality. Why? Many of us may have asked, why research spirituality? It's hard to pin down, it's controversial, and it's marginalized in many academic and professional contexts. So why research it? In my own case, I came to it as an educational researcher exploring, initially in the UK, how schools work as learning communities. Working with student teachers and with schools, I was often enough asked questions about the curriculum and policies in schools, with an expectation that I could either justify what was in place or explain what might be an improvement. And I'd worked in religious education, so questions related to religion often came up. Now, religious education is well established in UK schooling and has been required of English and Welsh schools since the 1944 Education Act, almost half a century before any other subject was statutorily established. Now, much as I had and have many issues with religious education, I was and am convinced that it was a valuable part of the school curriculum. The 1944 Education Act also, however, required all state or community schools to start every day with an act of collective worship on the part of all pupils in attendance at the school. And I was and am convinced that that requirement is inappropriate. However, the same act had a third requirement, that schools contribute towards the spiritual development of the community. On that, I was less sure, so I began researching spirituality simply, initially, because in the UK, spiritual development is a statutory requirement for all community schools, and I wanted to explore whether this was appropriate and what it might therefore mean. This rather mundane interest led to my researching spirituality, as I said, and looking across the various academic and professional accounts of spirituality, I found two broad traditions. One described spirituality or the spirit as a distinct substance, for example, distinct from the material or from this world. The other tradition in spirituality seemed to describe it in terms of relationships. And from the perspective of someone trying to find an approach to spirituality that would be appropriate in community schools, I believed that the first would be less appropriate, as not everyone would agree that there was a spirit as a separate substance, as in debates in the US about a spiritual war between angels and demons, or God and the devil, and so on. Not everyone would agree that there was such a spirit world. The second seemed more appropriate as being relational, is not restricted to people with particular religious or other philosophical views on what substances existed. And more positively, I found also that relational approaches to spirituality seemed to be, to me, more helpful or explanatory across religious and non-religious ways of life. I therefore became convinced of a relational approach to spirituality, broadly as described by David Hay. And I should say, although this isn't going to be a significant part of this talk, that I have applied that both to people in an immediate relationship with other people and people in solitude. I've talked elsewhere about different routes out of a divided self, routes through connection with other people directly, through ecstatic experiences, going out of oneself to be in contact with others, but also routes through enstatic, through going into oneself, through solitudinous practices of various kinds. There are different routes to a greater oneness or wholeness. As I say, that's not going to be a significant element of my talk today. So, having worked in schools as learning communities, relational spirituality complemented my broader philosophical and sociological work on schools. And it was my community orientation that led me to expand the Spirit of the Child work of David Hay and Rebecca Nye to the Spirit of the School work, published as a book in 2009. In that project, I was initially open-minded about how or whether different aspects of spirituality might be evidenced in schools. Researching in 13 schools, 9 in the UK, 4 in Hong Kong, China, I ended up convinced that spirituality might be found in schools and that it might make sense to talk about the spirit of the school. Now, although it's a nerve-wracking experience, I still recommend going into a research project open to the possibility of finding nothing of significance or of finding your initial understanding of things quite wrong. There are ways of mitigating the nerve-wracking character of such research with working definitions and professional models of what's being studied, but especially with a concept as complex and ambiguous as spirituality, exploring the ineffable is likely to lead us to unexpected places. Anyway, once I developed a sense of what I meant by spirituality and how it might be evidenced, I explored how it might apply to different aspects of professional practice, which I'll talk about later in this meeting. This in turn led to a wider ranging concern with what might be called the spirit of education applied to education into and for professional practice. So whether in teaching or nursing or physiotherapy, I found overlapping yet distinct concerns with spirituality, spiritual development, meeting spiritual needs, holistic learning, and person-centeredness. So as I say, my background is in schools, initially as a school student, then as a university student, then as a teacher and teacher trainer, and all those times, in all 4 roles, I was taking part in processes of investigation leading to new insights, more or less effectively shared. That is, I was researching as a school student, as a university student, as a teacher, and as a teacher trainer. My doctoral research explored how schools worked, initially in terms of support, hierarchies, and learning, and this gradually became an articulation of developing schools as learning communities. And it's the concept of community that came to dominate the thesis, which came from the Scottish philosopher John McMurray. For McMurray, a community involves a group of people treating each other as ends in themselves rather than as means to further ends. He described groups furthering ends as associations or as societies, in contrast to communities. And in his striking account of schooling, he described schools as communities, not societies, and his was a substantive definition of schools, not an aspirational description of them. Our first principle, he said, is that a school must be a real community. This is not because community is a good thing, I would underline this, he said, but because this is the condition of success in its educational function. As only in a community can a living culture be developed. He continued, the school is a community and we learn to live in a community only by living in a community. It's a necessary part of the school's business to absorb new children every year and to integrate them into the community of the school. It's in such a context of schools as necessarily communities, in McMurray's very distinctive sense, that spiritual development as a statutory requirement of all community schools makes sense to me. The spirit of the school as a community can make sense. I worked on a brief sabbatical in Seattle in the USA, just as my book, The Spirit of the School, had been completed, and I talked about the research in some detail. After one extended discussion with research students there on spirituality as a matter of overcoming dualism, one of the students emailed me. She asked me to explain what I meant. This is what I wrote to her. I said many philosophical and religious systems talk about there being two or more types of stuff. Some talk about mind and body being the two types of stuff. Descartes was one of those. Some talk about the world of me, what I know and can see and think, and the world of not me, or the difference between the subjective and the objective world. Some talked about the world we inhabit and a transcendent God. Many Christians would describe the world and God in those ways. Where there are two worlds, this is usually called dualism, i.e. two-ness. There's more than two worlds. I'm not sure what the right word is, perhaps pluralism. But anyway, dualists believe that there are two types of stuff or two worlds. However, the question arises, can these worlds connect to each other? The question is different, or the answer is different, depending on what kind of dualism the person believes. I'll mention some of the issues for each of the three types of dualism I mentioned earlier. If the mind and body are separate stuff, like Descartes said, then how can thinking affect the body? If we have free will, we can think whatever we like. There doesn't seem any point in that unless we can also affect our bodies. If there are two worlds, the me world and the not me world, then how can I know anything about the rest of the world? How can I know anything else exists? Couldn't it all be a figment of my imagination? And if we live in one world and there is a God that is completely transcendent apart from this world, then how can we know God? And for that matter, how can God affect this world? Well, those are the problems, but people have tried to say that dualism is not complete and that the two worlds are really connected. They say the division is not absolute, but can be overcome. It is contingent, depends on something else happening. In fact, many people say there is a constant battle between the two substances, a kind of argument. The Greeks refer to this kind of argument or battle as dialectical. So most dualists are contingent or dialectical dualists. My view is that spirituality, or the spirit, is the overcoming of this contingent dualism, the links between the otherwise separated, divided substances. The student replied to me, "Thank you for your response. This is intense stuff." She's right, but overcoming contingent dualism is still the closest I get to a definition of spirituality, albeit a definition that means spirituality has many different forms and meanings, and so still can't be pinned down to a single ideal type. Anyway, enough of overcoming contingent dualisms. In the end, my definition of the spirit of the school, the result of, not the basis for, my research in 13 schools, was and remains this. The spirited school is an inclusive community with magnanimous leadership that enables friendship through dialogue in order to create and evaluate valuable or beautiful meanings, valuable or beautiful things, and good people. There is, of course, a longer version, several longer versions of the definition that describes the particular elements of the definition in much more detail. I won't go through all of them here. What I'm interested in is, following the project, that I continued researching spirituality with a little more confidence. Now, although I'd used a number of research tools to explore the spirit of the school in the original project, I'm happy talking about those. After completing the project, having achieved a definition, I developed a specific set of 6 questions based on the definition coming out of the project, which could be asked of a school or any aspect of a school. The 6 questions to be asked of others and of ourselves were: who do you bring in? How do you treat people as ends in themselves? In what ways are you magnanimous? How do you enable friendship to thrive? Are you in dialogue? And how do you take part in creating meanings, things, and people. These questions I used directly in research on assessment feedback in schools and universities and on computer use. And I also used these and related questions in overlapping research on solitude, silence, and loneliness. In context other than schools and other learning communities, I realized the 6 questions could still be used, although the 6th question on creating meanings, things, and people might need some adjustment. Anyway, although I worked mainly in education departments, I've spread out quite a bit over the years. Feel free calling this middle-aged spread. As well as working with teachers in schools and those training for the teaching profession, I've worked with teaching assistants, with higher education professionals, with professionals and professional training for nursing, social work, counselling, religious ministry in different religions, philosophy, physiotherapy, computing, musical instrument performance, research methodology, military education specialists, and various business disciplines. And this in turn led to a wider ranging concern with what might be called the spirit of education. The spirit of education can be applied to education into and for professional practice. And across a number of professional contexts, I found overlapping distinct concerns with spirituality, spiritual development, meeting spiritual needs, holistic learning, and person-centeredness. For example, whereas in school teaching in the UK, there was a focus on spiritual development, in nursing, instead of spiritual development, there was a concern with meeting spiritual needs. In the US, many of the debates on what in the UK might be called spirituality centered instead on holistic learning, with spirituality often used instead to refer to religious induction into religious communities. In nursing, it was meeting spiritual needs. In physiotherapy training, more of the debate seems to have been on person-centered approaches, more like the US holistic approaches. And so I feel in a position to comment on professionalism beyond just the school teaching profession. And as a professor, I should add that professors, by definition and in practice, profess things. In other words, being a professor gives one a position from which to promote with some authority a particular position. The links for me between professing, being a professor, and being a professional are threefold. Firstly, there are values. Professing, being a professor, and professionalism are all characterized by holding values, with these values having some persistence and some independence. That is, they're not simply given by others outside the profession, such as governments, but have some independent status, notwithstanding any external influences. So, second characteristic is learning. To profess generally results from a period of learning or contemplation. Being a professor involves developing and sharing new insights, primarily through research, and professions are generally characterized by particular qualifications as evidence of specialist learning. All typically require continuing learning. That is, professors are expected to continue researching, professionals are expected to keep up to date with developments in the profession, and a person who professes is usually expected to continue developing their ideas or their practices. The third element, common to all three of professing professors and professionals, is care. Whether care is shown for that which is professed, or for the insights gained and the objects of study, or, as in the caring professions, for other people, or for other professions, the objects of the profession. Care is central to all. Following noddings, I describe care as ethical when it is mutual. In the 1930s, the sociologist Waller, and later, currently, the sociologist Lawrence Lightfoot, described teachers as society's professional adults. And that's an interesting phrase, suggesting that in any role in society, being professional adds certain qualities. And I suggest these are, as I've described above, values, learning, and care. Linking to my spirituality research, I return to those three qualities, therefore, illustrated from the spirituality big questions. Values. Who do we bring in through engaging in dialogue within and between communities, recognizing intersectionality, whilst critically maintaining values and recognizing other potentially valid values? Who do we bring in? Learning, how do we help create meanings, things, and people? And in caring, how do we treat people as ends in themselves? How do we demonstrate magnanimity? How do we support friendship? I hope it goes without saying that different professions will have different values, different approaches to learning, as well as different things to learn, and different ways of caring, but all spirited professional practice overcomes these contingent dualisms, supporting specific values in a value diverse world, knowing whilst also learning. This is, as described by Lave, rising to a concrete relational conception of apprenticeship and in the process becoming apprentices to our own future practice. And caring in a way that accepts as well as gives care, accepting the mutuality of all ethical care. And I suggest that unspirited professional practice, in contrast, imposes values on others, or lets others impose values on them, imposes knowledge and ignores the knowledge of others, and involves what Noddings describes as non-mutual caregiving rather than ethical caring. So moving from unspirited to more spirited professionalism is a matter itself of education. And that's the topic of my next section. Given what I've said about spirituality and professionalism, how might that translate into education for professional practice? Those new to a profession generally go through the most intense period of education, but the education continues throughout a person's engagement in the profession. To support professional values in a values diverse world, I suggest there needs to be three particular aspects of education. Education, firstly, in doing the right thing and explaining why we believe it right. I find it interesting that values-driven professionals all too rarely explain those values, but when they do, this is generally welcomed by those they work with. It also requires education in seeing and trying to understand other people's different positions on what is right and allowing that to be explained to you. Thirdly, it involves education in real dialogue, what Buber describes as real fantasy, imagining the real, being in touch with the other person whilst remaining in our own professional place. Learning continues as we remain apprentices in our own practice. This endlessness of the learning can be described in the following Jumi window. I can give some background to that. In 2002, justifying the USA's invasion of Iraq following 9/11, the US Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld described what they did and didn't know about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. And he described them in terms of the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. Much as this speech was much lampooned, not least because of the policy it was used to justify, Rumsfeld took this idea from the well-established Johari window. It was developed by psychologists whose first name were Joseph and Harry. More recently, I've worked with my colleague Amy Quickfall on a new version of this window, so we've named it in a similar way the Jumi window. In professional training, this window can be used as a guide to what types of knowledge and access to knowledge might be worked on during professional training. So here's the Jumi window for professional practice and other contexts. You'll see there are 4 windows marked by Down the left-hand side, what other people know, maybe about me or about an established field, what other people don't know about me or an established or new field. And across the top, what I know about myself or about other things, and what I don't know, also about myself or an established piece of knowledge. So this creates 4 windows. Window A is the known knowns. These are things known by us and by others, well-established facts, if you like. Then there's window B, the unknown by me knowns, the unknown knowns, e.g. a language not yet learned by me, but of course known by other people, a set of facts to be learned, well-established information or ideas. The 2 bottom windows start with window C. These are the known unknowns, the things known by me but unknown by others. For example, my secrets or my as yet unshared insights. And window 4 are the unknown unknowns, e.g. the profoundly mysterious or ineffable. It's important to see the Jumi window as illustrating different aspects of professional training, of formal training more generally, and how, I have to say, in my experience, much formal learning restricts itself to the top 2 boxes, the well-established knowledge, and all too rarely recognises the original insights and the as yet ineffable knowledge of the bottom 2 boxes. Yet any profession that recognises the value of research, or more especially researching, should have an inbuilt tendency towards the bottom 2 boxes as well as the top 2 boxes. Any professional that recognises value diversity and the need to understand other people's values should also tend to the bottom 2 boxes as well as the top 2 boxes. But there is, in my experience, all too little of that. What I think is needed in spirited professional education is education in caring that goes beyond caregiving. Noddings makes this distinction in explaining care ethics, and her often repeated example is Nurse Ratched in the novel and the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. For those of you who know the film, Nurse Ratched gave care, gave medicine, gave various sorts of care, but did not sufficiently recognise the personhood of those to whom she gave the care, making it a wholly asymmetrical relationship with no acceptance of the reality and value of others, and therefore no mutuality in the relationship. This was caregiving, but not ethical care. Noddings writes of schools, similarly of teachers and taught, needing to express caring, ethical care, not just caregiving. She says the same of nurses and the nursed, and the same could be said of physios and clients, and so on. Mutuality is central to care. The writer and broadcaster Rabbi Lionel Blue, in one of his talks on BBC Radio 4, described a recent hospital visit that he'd had. He noted how professional and how kind the nurses were, and talked about their training, which was then and now all university-based. I've found, he said, I've found the kindness of nurses as essential as the technology. But, he said, how do you teach kindness on a degree course? Well, I think there has to be a way. And I guess that's our job in looking at the spirituality as it applies to professional practice, is how do we explore those bottom 2 boxes, those bottom 2 windows in the Jumi window, those rather more complex, ineffable aspects of the profession that we have to explore if we are going to have more spirited professions. Now we're getting to the conclusion of what I want to say, and I've said a great deal about spirituality, professionalism, and professional education, all underpinned by the need for investigating, learning, gaining new insights, and not just depending on already established knowledge, and sharing such insights, explaining what we're doing. i.e., it's all underpinned by the process of research. our own research as well as the research of other people. And so I'll end with a simple piece of research that we can take part in now. If you remember at the beginning of the talk, I shared a photograph that I took of a classroom in the USA. Here's a picture of what I think is a fairly typical classroom in many parts of the world, not distinctive to the USA. I appreciate that most people perhaps at this conference may not be school-based professionals, but I hope you'll still be able to spot some evidence from this picture related to what I've called spirited professionalism. I took the picture in part because most stock pictures of classrooms looked so unlike the classrooms I see. So these are the three initial questions I suspect we ask of this picture. Can we see evidence in the picture of professional values in a world of value diversity? Can we see evidence in the picture of professional knowing and learning and ongoing apprenticeship? And can we see evidence of care, which is more than caregiving? In my own view, the extent to which the answer to these questions is yes, is the extent to which we're seeing evidence of spirited professional practice. That's what I hope to be promoting. So let's go back and look again at the picture. Is there evidence there of professional values in a world of value diversity? Can you see any of that? It looked to me, and still looks, I was in the classroom and saw what was happening, as though there seems to be a lot going on that's quite different. The different students in the classroom seem to be working on different projects. And yet, from the various plans that I saw and from the actions in the photograph later in the classroom, from other photographs, the students later brought together their different ideas. They were preparing to present their ideas to each other. Now, I think that suggests there was some acknowledgement of value diversity, the different positions of the different students, and yet attempting to bring those together within a single system. Maybe you think otherwise. I'd be interested in your views. Can we, however, see evidence of professional knowing and learning and ongoing apprenticeship? Again, the idea that this photograph, unlike a lot of stock photographs of classrooms, which has a teacher, maybe a smiling teacher, with all the students having their eyes set on the teacher and the teacher telling the pupils something, this suggests that the teacher is letting the pupils explore, letting the pupils learn for themselves so that the teacher in turn can learn from what the pupils are learning. Perhaps you have different ideas. I'd be interested in what those are. And can we see evidence of care which is more than caregiving? Most photographs of classrooms, the stock photographs, have caregiving, certainly. It looks like the teacher is caring for the students, but as you can see in this picture, the teacher is not in the picture, and it's not that the teacher is standing behind me staring out the students. As you can see, the students are not looking at a teacher. The teacher is at the other end of the classroom and is still teaching in managing the system in which I think she, and it was a woman who was the teacher, she is showing evidence of care by respecting the learning of the pupils. In my own view, there's evidence, you may have different ideas, I'd be interested to hear them, but in my own view, the absence of the dominant teacher in that photograph and the evidence of the absence of a dominant teacher in the photograph is evidence that the teacher is caring in the sense of expressing the mutuality of care and not just caregiving. So, in my own view, from answering these three questions, even from a single photograph, attempting to answer these three questions, I think there is some evidence of a more spirited professional practice. Indeed, I remember myself when I started training to teach, I used to think when I started that I should be judged on my performance characteristics as a teacher, my ability to hold the eyes and the ears of the students whilst they passively received my wisdom. I soon found out that my tutor happily did not have that view of a classroom, and said, as we went through the different classes that I was taking, that my classes where I was asking and expecting the students to do their own work and then draw it together and draw it out, as well as my performing for the students, was much more educationally effective, much more dialogic, much more careful, I might say. So I offer to you a model of spirituality, the overcoming of contingent dualisms, that ties in with being professional, professing, and, for that matter, being a professor, in a way that shows how professionalism can be more spirited. That's all I want to say. I've written a lot on spirituality, but also on how schools work, a philosophy of schooling, on various forms of teaching, on issues in solitude and loneliness, and issues in terms of research and more dialogic research. And I'd welcome your views, either directly at this conference or after the conference, by email or in other ways. I'd welcome your views on this whole situation. Thank you very much.